Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. Beneath the shadow of forgotten hills, there lies a story so grotesque, so unholy, that even whispers of it were buried in shame. Imagine a mother not simply raising her son, but taking him as her husband, a love so warped, so suffocating, it crossed the final threshold of taboo. What you're about to hear isn't folklore, nor is it exaggeration. It is the record of a woman who defied the laws of nature, and a boy who never had the chance to escape her grasp. This was not just a family broken by poverty or isolation. It was a family that dissolved the very boundary between parent and child. And yet, for decades, they lived this way in silence, tucked into the cracks of rural America, where the neighbors turned their heads and the land itself seemed to bury their sins beneath its dirt. Tonight, I will lead you into that silence and peel back the truth of the most inbred mother ever known. Her story begins in poverty. A girl born into neglect, stripped of education, of guidance, of love. She grew in a world where no one taught her boundaries, where the adults around her were themselves tangled in strange relationships and whispered betrayals. By the time she became a woman, her understanding of love was already corrupted. When she bore a son, she did not see him as a child. She saw him as the only man who would never leave her. While others built families rooted in tradition, she built one rooted in obsession. In her eyes, he was not her blood. He was her salvation. And when he was old enough to speak, old enough to obey, she bound him not with chains, but with the crushing weight of maternal authority. He was told from his earliest memory that he belonged to her and her alone. Most mothers dream of watching their sons grow, break free, and carve their own lives into the world. But for her, that thought was unbearable. His freedom was her greatest threat. She would not let him go, not to school, not to love, not to anyone. And in the silence of their one-room shack, she began to groom him into a role no son should ever bear. It was slow, deliberate, and terrifying in its inevitability. By the time neighbors suspected anything, it was too late. They were no longer mother and son. They were, in the shadows of secrecy, man and wife. The boy never had a chance to resist. From his earliest years, he learned that love meant submission, that loyalty meant silence. When other children were learning how to play, how to make friends, how to discover the world, he was being taught a different lesson, that his very body was not his own. She whispered into his ears that no woman outside their home would ever love him the way she did, that no one could care for him the way she could, and so every attempt at rebellion withered before it began. He carried the shame like a second skin, not knowing it was shame at all, only believing it was destiny. By the time he reached manhood, his identity was already hollowed out. He was not a son. He was not even truly a man. He was an extension of her will, molded into the husband she always wanted but could never find. The line between right and wrong was erased so early that he couldn't even see it anymore. And when she bore his children, they were introduced not as grandchildren, but as the next broken links in a chain that should never have been forged. The children who came from this union bore the curse carved into their very bones. Some were born frail, with twisted features and weakened minds. Others carried the haunting silence of genetic despair, their eyes empty, their growth stunted. In the countryside, where neighbors whispered but rarely interfered, the family became a spectacle, a living reminder of what happens when boundaries collapse. People avoided their home, not only because of the rumors, but because of the visible truth in the faces of the children. It was written into their bodies, an inescapable testimony of what had been done to them. Yet, despite the grotesque reality, the mother carried herself as though nothing was wrong. She spoke of her marriage as though it were blessed by God himself, a secret covenant misunderstood by outsiders. To her, love justified all things, even desecration. She believed she had created a bond purer than any found in churches or courts, and while the world recoiled in horror, she convinced herself she was chosen, that her son was hers, not only by blood, but by fate. The boy, now man, now husband, remained silent, not because he agreed, but because the weight of years had crushed his will. He did not know where his mother ended and where he began. The house they lived in became a prison disguised as a home. Its walls held secrets that seeped into every corner, into the very floorboards. To outsiders, it was just another forgotten shack along a dirt road. Peeling paint, broken windows, a yard where grass never seemed to grow. But inside, the air was heavy with silence, with the kind of dread that only those who lived there could feel. The son had grown into a man without choices, yet every day he played the role she demanded of him, the obedient husband, the father to children who carried his own fractured blood. Neighbors rarely visited. When they did, they often left quickly, their eyes darting, their voices lowered, as if the house itself might swallow them if they stayed too long. They saw enough to know something was wrong. The children with their strange features, their slow movements, their vacant stares. The mother with her possessive grip on her son's arm, introducing him not as her child, but with a smirk that carried more than words ever could. People whispered about reporting them, about intervention, but in that era, in that isolated stretch of America, family business was considered untouchable. Sin could fester, generation after generation, so long as it stayed quiet enough. But silence cannot contain horror forever. The children grew, and with them, the visible evidence of what had happened became impossible to ignore. Some did not survive infancy. Others grew into adults who could never fully care for themselves, their minds fractured as much as their lineage. Doctors who examined them noted features they could not explain without speaking aloud the word no one dared: inbreeding. Every glance, every diagnosis was another nail sealing the family's reputation into infamy. And yet she remained unmoved. In her eyes, each child was proof of devotion, proof that her son had never abandoned her, proof that their bond was unbreakable. The more the world recoiled, the tighter she clung to the delusion that what she had built was sacred. Her son, meanwhile, aged before his time. The weight of his role carved deep lines into his face. He no longer looked like a victim, nor like a man. He looked like a ghost, hollowed out from within, watching his own life play out as if it belonged to someone else. In every town there are legends, hauntings, curses, things that drive families to ruin. But here the curse was not supernatural. It was human, flesh and blood. A mother's hunger that devoured her own bloodline. By the time the truth began to surface beyond whispers, it was already too late for redemption. Generations had been scarred, both physically and spiritually, by one woman's hunger to possess what was never meant to be hers. The local authorities were reluctant to act, not out of ignorance, but out of fear. Fear of opening a wound so deep it would taint the entire community. To admit what had happened meant acknowledging that they had all seen the signs, all heard the rumors, and yet turned away. It was easier to call it gossip, easier to bury the shame beneath silence, than to confront the grotesque reality unfolding in their own backyards. The children grew older, but their lives were marked by limitation. Some wandered the countryside, stared at and mocked by outsiders who did not know the truth, but could see it written into their faces. Others never left the home, bound not only by their conditions, but by the suffocating control of the woman who called herself both mother and wife. They became shadows, drifting through a world that was never meant to hold them, embodying the price of secrecy. The mother aged too, but age did not bring remorse. If anything, it hardened her conviction. She told those who asked that she had lived a life of love, a life untouched by betrayal, a life in which her son had never left her side. And though she never admitted guilt, her eyes carried the defiance of someone who knew she had broken every boundary, yet refused to bend to judgment. To her, outsiders were blind. They could not see the purity she claimed to have created. But the son, His silence became louder than any confession. He rarely spoke, rarely looked anyone in the eye. Those who did catch his gaze said it was like staring into a void, an emptiness carved by decades of coercion, by years of carrying a role that should never have existed. He was no longer just a man trapped by circumstance. He was a man erased by it. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have tried to escape, or would silence have claimed you too? Because that is the question this story forces upon us. It is not only about what happened inside one shack to one family, it is about the lengths to which silence, shame and neglect can let horror flourish unchecked. And it asks, without mercy, when the line between mother and lover is destroyed, what kind of legacy is left behind? The legacy was not just written in the faces of the children, but in the soil itself. Neighbors said the land felt cursed, that no matter how many seasons passed, the fields around the house yielded less and less. The air hung heavier there, as if grief itself had taken root. Travelers passing through would remark on the strange quiet, how birds never seemed to linger in the trees above that shack, how even the wind seemed to hush as it crossed the property line. It was as though nature itself recoiled from what had taken place inside. Yet the most haunting part was not the house, nor the land, nor even the grotesque legacy of children who bore the weight of their parents' sins. It was the normalization of horror. Within those walls, what should have been unthinkable became routine. The mother did not flinch at calling her son husband. The children did not question their blurred place in the family, because there was no other truth presented to them. Generations raised inside of madness come to believe madness is the natural order. And when that belief settles, the curse extends far beyond blood. It takes root in the human spirit. Records show that some of the children tried to leave. They wandered into towns, attempted to find work, sought connection, but the stigma followed them like a shadow. People knew who they were, even if they didn't know the full story. Their faces marked them as outcasts. Some drank themselves into oblivion, others returned to the home, the only place where they were not stared at, because everyone inside bore the same burden. And so, the cycle of entrapment continued, not always through choice, but through the crushing weight of inevitability. As the years dragged on, the son grew older, and whispers spread that his health had declined rapidly. Some said it was the stress, others said it was the bloodline catching up to him, but the truth was simpler. His body could not carry the torment of a stolen life forever. He became frail, dependent, and in that weakness, his mother's grip only tightened. Even when he was no longer strong enough to work the land, he was forced to remain in the role she had carved for him. Until his last breath, he was not her child. He was her possession. And when he finally died, the townspeople said she did not weep like a grieving mother. She sat on the porch, stone-faced, staring into the distance, as though a part of her knew the story had ended. Not in tragedy, but in fulfillment of her twisted devotion. When death finally broke the bond between them, the story should have ended. But in truth, it lingered, festering in memory, staining the lives of those left behind. The children, now without their father-brother and their mother-grandmother's obsession, drifted further into ruin. Some could not survive on their own, their minds too fractured, their bodies too weak. Others carried the shame outward, trying to escape, but finding the world was not willing to forget where they had come from. They were marked people, relics of a scandal too grotesque to be forgiven. The mother herself lived on, aging into a figure both feared and pitied. People avoided her not only for what she had done, but for what she represented. The reminder that evil does not always come in the form of violence or murder. Sometimes it comes in the form of love corrupted beyond recognition. To the end of her life, she never admitted wrongdoing. She spoke with conviction that her love had been misunderstood, that outsiders had twisted her story into something monstrous. In her eyes, she had preserved her family. In reality, she had destroyed it. Historians who pieced together fragments of this story found it difficult to separate rumor from truth, fact from folklore, but even when stripped of exaggeration, the bones of the story remain horrifying, A mother who became her son's wife, children born into confusion and deformity, a community that turned its head rather than intervene. It forces us to ask not just how such a thing could happen, but how it could be allowed to continue for so long in plain sight. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all, that silence is complicity. The neighbors who whispered but never spoke, the authorities who knew but never acted, the families who avoided but never helped, they all became part of the story. Without their silence, perhaps the son could have tears caped. Perhaps the children might have lived different lives, but silence allowed the curse to take root, and it grew until it devoured an entire bloodline. This is the kind of story history tries to bury, not because it is forgotten, but because it is too disturbing to confront. And yet in the shadows of America's past, these are the stories that reveal the deepest truths about human weakness. When love turns into obsession, when family becomes prison, when silence replaces justice, horror is born. And so, we return to the question that lingers long after the last page of this story is closed. What becomes of a bloodline consumed by its own mother? The children scattered into obscurity, their names erased, their faces lost to time except in fragments of old photographs where the deformities still speak louder than words. Some died young, their bodies unable to endure the genetic weight forced upon them. Others lived into adulthood but carried with them the unshakable mark of shame, never quite belonging anywhere, always haunted by whispers they could not outrun. They were not only victims of blood, they were victims of memory, of being tied forever to a history no one wanted to claim. The mother was buried in the same earth where she had committed her sins, her grave unadorned, her story unspoken by the community that had once feared her. To this day, the ground is said to feel unsettled there, as if the soil itself refuses to rest above her. It is not the kind of story that makes it into textbooks or church sermons. It is the kind of story that rots in silence, passed down only in hushed tones, warnings disguised as rumors. And yet, here it is, dug back up from the shadows, laid bare for those willing to face it. What makes this tale so chilling is not only the grotesque act itself, but what it represents, the fragility of human boundaries. When guidance is stripped away, when poverty and isolation smother choice, when a community looks away, the unthinkable becomes possible. The line between mother and son was not shattered in one night. It was eroded over years until there was nothing left to separate them. What remains is a legacy carved into human bodies, into lives that never had a chance to be whole. And perhaps in the end, that is why stories like this are remembered at all, not as entertainment, not as folklore, but as warnings, warnings that silence so allows evil to grow unchecked, warnings that love, when twisted into possession, can destroy not only one soul, but entire generations. Warnings that history's darkest truths are not locked away in castles or dungeons, but hidden in plain sight, in lonely homes, in forgotten towns, in families that collapse inward until nothing is left. This was the story of the most inbred mother in history, a woman who married her own son, and in doing so, married herself to tragedy.